In 1941, while Allied bombers targeted Berlin's industrial districts, Daimler-Benz operated underground factories where prisoners built aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. The company that would become synonymous with luxury and engineering excellence was manufacturing weapons using slave labor, and after the war ended, they spent 4 decades pretending it never happened. Mercedes-Benz didn't formally acknowledge this history until 1987, 42 years after Germany's surrender. That delay wasn't an accident, it was corporate strategy. You're looking at one of the most successful reputation transformations in business history. The company that built Hitler's parade cars and profited from concentration camp labor became the global symbol of prestige and quality. But the truth eventually surfaced, and when it did, it changed not just Mercedes-Benz, but the entire German automotive industry's approach to corporate responsibility, transparency, and historical reckoning. This is the story of how German car companies learned that you can't build the future on buried secrets. The transformation began long before anyone acknowledged the problem. To understand why Mercedes-Benz buried their Nazi past, you need to understand what that past actually contained. And it was worse than most people imagine. Daimler-Benz AG merged in 1926, combining Karl Benz's company with Gottlieb Daimler's operation. By the early 1930s, they were Germany's largest automobile manufacturer, producing luxury cars for the wealthy and commercial vehicles for industry. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, German industry faced a choice. The Nazi regime offered contracts, protection, and access to capital. But cooperation meant complicity in a system that was already showing authoritarian tendencies. Daimler-Benz leadership chose cooperation. Wilhelm Kissel, the company's chairman from 1926 to 1942, joined the Nazi Party and began positioning the company to benefit from rearmament contracts. The timing of Kissel's party membership is significant. He joined in 1933, the same year Hitler took power. This wasn't waiting to see how things developed. It was immediate alignment with the new regime. Kissel wasn't alone. Other senior executives at Daimler-Benz joined the Nazi Party in the early 1930s, creating a management structure aligned with regime priorities. This wasn't coercion. The party actively recruited business leaders, but membership remained voluntary, especially in the early years. The company saw opportunity in Hitler's rearmament plans. The Treaty of Versailles had restricted German military development after World War I. But Hitler openly planned to violate these restrictions and rebuild Germany's armed forces. Daimler-Benz positioned itself to supply this rearmament. The company's engineering capabilities in engines, both automotive and aircraft, made them valuable to military planners. In 1934, the company began receiving contracts for truck production for the Wehrmacht. These weren't just any trucks. Daimler-Benz developed the L3000 series, heavy-duty military trucks designed specifically for Army logistics. The vehicles could carry 3-ton payloads across rough terrain, essential for mobile military operations. The company produced thousands of these trucks through the late 1930s, ramping up production as Hitler's rearmament accelerated. By 1938, military contracts represented a substantial portion of Daimler-Benz's revenue. This wasn't just passive compliance. Daimler-Benz actively courted military contracts, retooled factories for weapons production, and integrated themselves into the Nazi war machine long before conflict began. The company invested heavily in expanding production capacity specifically for military orders. New factory buildings were constructed at Untertürkheim and Mannheim, designed to manufacture military vehicles and components at scale. The company's engineering expertise made them valuable. Daimler-Benz produced aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe, including the DB601 that powered the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, Germany's primary air superiority aircraft throughout the war. These weren't peripheral products. The DB601 engine was critical to Germany's early air warfare success, and Daimler-Benz manufactured thousands of them between 1937 and 1945. The DB601 was a liquid-cooled, inverted V12 engine, initially producing around 1,100 PS. The inverted design, with cylinders pointing downward, lowered the aircraft's center of gravity and improved pilot visibility over the nose. Daimler-Benz developed this engine through the 1930s, with early versions powering record-setting aircraft. The engine used direct fuel injection, an advanced technology that gave German fighters advantages in combat maneuvering. By 1940, Daimler-Benz factories were producing hundreds of DB601 engines monthly. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 became the backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force, and everyone needed a Daimler-Benz engine. The company didn't stop with the 601. They developed the DB603 and DB605, improved versions with more power and better high-altitude performance. These engines powered not just fighters, but also bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Production volumes were staggering. Daimler-Benz manufactured over 30,000 DB601 engines alone, plus thousands more of subsequent models. This represented one of the largest aircraft engine production programs in Germany during the war. The company's contribution to the Luftwaffe wasn't limited to fighters. Daimler-Benz engines powered the Heinkel He 111 bomber, used extensively in the Battle of Britain. The company's engineering supported Germany's strategic bombing campaign against British cities. These weren't just engines sold to a customer. Daimler-Benz engineers worked closely with Luftwaffe technical staff, refining designs based on combat feedback, solving reliability problems, developing variants for different mission requirements. The company also built trucks for the Wehrmacht, armored vehicles, and submarine diesel engines. By 1940, civilian automobile production had essentially ceased. Daimler-Benz had become a weapons manufacturer. But the most visible symbol of Daimler-Benz's Nazi collaboration was also the most mundane: luxury cars for regime officials. The company produced armored Mercedes-Benz 770 Grosser limousines specifically for Nazi leadership, including several for Hitler himself. These weren't just any cars. The 770 Grosser featured armor plating, bulletproof glass, and a 7.7-liter inline-8 engine producing 230 PS massive power for the era. The cars weighed over 4,000 kilograms with full armor protection. Hitler used these vehicles in parades and public appearances throughout the 1930s. The image of the Führer standing in an open Mercedes became one of the most recognizable propaganda images of the Nazi regime. For Daimler-Benz, these cars represented prestige and proximity to power. For history, they became symbols of German industry's complicity in fascism. The company built approximately 88 units of the 770 between 1930 and 1943, with many going to Nazi officials. But the luxury cars and aircraft engines were at the darkest chapter. That came with forced labor, the systematic use of prisoners, concentration camp inmates, and foreign workers compelled to manufacture weapons for Germany's war effort. Daimler-Benz employed forced laborers starting in 1940, as Germany occupied Europe and needed workers to replace German men drafted into military service. Initially, these were civilian workers from occupied territories, brought to Germany under various pretexts. The company recruited, though recruited implies choice, that often didn't exist, workers from Poland, France, Belgium, and other occupied countries. These civilians were told they'd work in German factories, receive wages, and return home after contributing to the war effort. Reality was different. Foreign workers faced harsh conditions, inadequate food, restricted movement, and the constant threat of punishment for perceived infractions. They weren't slaves in the chattel sense, but they weren't free workers either. By 1942, as the labor shortage intensified, Daimler-Benz began using concentration camp prisoners. The company operated facilities near several camps, including satellites of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The progression from foreign civilian workers to concentration camp prisoners marked a moral descent. Civilian workers, however exploited, retained some status as humans. Concentration camp prisoners were classified by the Nazi regime as subhuman, Jews, political prisoners, Romani people, Soviet POWs, marked for eventual destruction. Daimler-Benz requested these workers from the SS, specifying how many were needed and for what types of work. The company negotiated rates, a fee per prisoner per day, paid directly to the SS. This arrangement made Daimler-Benz a direct financial supporter of the concentration camp system. Historical research conducted in the 1980s and 90s documented that Daimler-Benz employed approximately 63,500 forced laborers during the war years, about half of the company's total workforce by 1944. These weren't just workers assigned to factories. Many were concentration camp prisoners, marked by the Nazi regime for extermination, but temporarily exploited for labor. They worked in brutal conditions, inadequate food, no safety equipment, punishing hours, and the constant threat of violence. The daily ration for concentration camp workers at Daimler-Benz facilities was typically well below subsistence levels. Workers received watery soup, small bread rations, and occasionally margarine or cheese, perhaps 1,000 calories daily for men performing heavy industrial labor. This wasn't neglect, it was deliberate policy. The Nazi system classified different worker categories with different ration levels. German workers received full rations. Foreign civilian workers received less. Concentration camp prisoners, particularly Jews and Soviet POWs, received the bare minimum necessary to extract labor before death. Working conditions were brutal. Shifts lasted 12 hours or more with minimal breaks. Safety equipment was non-existent for forced laborers. Protective gear was reserved for German workers. Injuries were common, medical care minimal. Punishment for infractions was immediate and violent. Workers who couldn't maintain pace, who made mistakes, or who violated arbitrary rules faced beatings from guards or foremen. Some were sent back to main concentration camps, which often meant death. Daimler-Benz operated an underground factory at Obergheim where prisoners manufactured aircraft engines. The facility was built specifically to protect production from Allied bombing, and workers were housed in appalling conditions with minimal survival provisions. The Obergheim facility used prisoners from Neckarals, a subcamp of Natzweiler Strafhof concentration camp. Approximately 1,000 prisoners worked there at any given time, with constant turnover, as workers died or became too weak to continue. The underground factory itself was carved into hillsides, with prisoners working in cold, damp conditions without adequate ventilation. The air quality in the tunnels was poor. Dust from machining operations, fumes from manufacturing processes, all concentrated in enclosed spaces. Workers slept in nearby barracks with minimal heating, insufficient blankets, and overcrowding that spread disease rapidly. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery killed prisoners regularly. Bodies were disposed of with minimal documentation. The company paid the SS for access to this labor, a fee per prisoner per day. This arrangement meant Daimler-Benz directly funded the concentration camp system while profiting from effectively free labor that produced weapons for the German military. The payment structure is important to understand. Daimler-Benz paid approximately 4 to 6 Reichsmarks per prisoner per day, far less than wages for German workers, but pure profit for the SS since prisoners received no compensation. This arrangement created perverse incentives. The SS wanted to keep prisoners alive just long enough to extract maximum labor value. Daimler-Benz wanted productive workers but faced no consequences for high mortality rates. Dead prisoners were simply replaced with new ones. Other Daimler-Benz facilities used different categories of forced labor. The Sindelfingen plant employed French civilian workers brought to Germany under the Service du Travail Obligatoire, compulsory work service in occupied France. These French workers had slightly better conditions than concentration camp prisoners, but still faced exploitation. They were separated from German workers, paid less, received smaller rations, and lived in barracks surrounded by guards. The Mannheim facility used Soviet POWs extensively. Under Nazi ideology, Soviets were considered subhuman, and their treatment as prisoners approached that of concentration camp inmates. They received minimal food, no medical care, and brutal punishment for any resistance. By 1944, forced laborers constituted the majority of Daimler-Benz's workforce across all facilities. The company's wartime production depended entirely on this coerced labor system. When Allied forces liberated these facilities in 1945, they discovered the conditions. American and British military investigators documented the factories, interviewed survivors, and began building cases for war crimes tribunals. The evidence was overwhelming. Allied investigators found detailed production records, payroll documents showing payments to the SS, architectural plans for underground factories, and thousands of surviving prisoners who could testify about conditions. Some survivors were so weak they couldn't walk. Others had permanent injuries from industrial accidents that received no medical treatment. Many died in the weeks after liberation, their bodies too damaged by malnutrition and disease to recover even with proper care. But here's where the story takes its first turn toward burial. In the chaos of post-war Germany, with infrastructure destroyed and the economy collapsed, the Allies prioritized rebuilding over prosecution for most corporate leaders. The Nuremberg trials focused primarily on government and military officials, those who'd planned and executed the Holocaust, aggressive war, and other crimes. Corporate executives received attention, but they weren't the priority. Several Daimler-Benz executives faced charges at the Nuremberg trials. Most received relatively light sentences, or were acquitted, with tribunals distinguishing between those who implemented Nazi policy and those who merely cooperated with it. This distinction mattered legally but seemed absurd morally. The executives who requested concentration camp labor, who paid the SS, who knowingly profited from slave labor, they were classified as cooperating rather than implementing. The tribunals decided their crimes were less severe than those of SS administrators or camp commanders. The sentences reflected this logic. Where concentration camp commandants faced execution, corporate executives typically received prison terms of a few years, and many of those sentences were commuted or reduced. Wilhelm Kissel retired in 1942 and died in 1946, never facing significant consequences. His successors at Daimler-Benz largely continued in their positions after brief denazification proceedings. Denazification was supposed to remove Nazi supporters from positions of influence in post-war Germany. In practice, it became a bureaucratic process where individuals filled out questionnaires about their party membership and wartime activities, faced review by denazification tribunals, and usually received classifications that allowed them to continue their careers. Most Daimler-Benz executives were classified as followers rather than offenders or major offenders. This classification meant they'd cooperated with the Nazi regime, but weren't considered responsible for its crimes. They paid fines, maybe faced temporary employment restrictions, then returned to their positions. This lenient treatment had practical justifications. Post-war Germany needed functioning industry to rebuild. Daimler-Benz factories were damaged but operational, and the company's engineering expertise was valuable for reconstruction. The Allied occupation authorities, particularly the Americans, believed that prosecuting all corporate leaders who'd cooperated with the Nazis would cripple German industry. Better to focus on the worst offenders and allow others to contribute to rebuilding. The company itself faced no substantial reparations specifically for forced labor. Allied authorities focused on dismantling Germany's war-making capacity, not on punishing individual corporations for their role in the Nazi system. Some Daimler-Benz factories were dismantled, particularly those that had produced military equipment. Machinery was removed as reparations, buildings destroyed to prevent future weapons production. But the company's core capabilities remained intact. This lenient treatment set the stage for what came next. 40 years of institutional forgetting. Daimler-Benz emerged from the war's rubble with its manufacturing capabilities damaged, but its core competencies intact. The company needed to rebuild, physically, financially, and reputationally. In 1946, they faced a Germany divided into occupation zones, a population struggling to survive, and a complete absence of the wealthy customers who'd bought Mercedes-Benz cars before the war. Konrad Adenauer became West Germany's first chancellor in 1949, and his government adopted a policy that historians call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. But in practice, this meant looking forward rather than backward. West Germany needed economic recovery to compete with Soviet-controlled East Germany. The Marshall Plan provided American capital, but success required German industry to function efficiently. Dwelling on corporate complicity in Nazi crimes didn't serve this goal. Daimler-Benz embraced this forward-looking attitude enthusiastically. The company's post-war communications focused entirely on engineering excellence, quality manufacturing, and building vehicles for a peaceful, prosperous future. By 1951, Mercedes-Benz had returned to motorsport, entering the Carrera Panamericana with 300 SL racing cars. The company wanted to reclaim its pre-war reputation for performance and innovation, not discuss what happened between 1939 and 1945. The strategy worked spectacularly. Mercedes-Benz re-entered Formula One in 1954, winning the World Championship in 1955 with driver Juan Manuel Fangio and the W196 racing car. That same year, the company introduced the 300 SL Gullwing, a road-going sports car that became an instant icon. The Gullwing doors, fuel-injected engine producing 215 PS, and stunning design captured global imagination. Wealthy customers in America and Europe saw the 300 SL as evidence that German engineering had returned to excellence. They didn't ask what Daimler-Benz built during the war. They wanted the fastest, most advanced sports car available. This selective memory extended throughout German society. The Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle of the 1950s, brought prosperity and employment. People wanted to move forward, not revisit the immediate past. Mercedes-Benz marketed themselves as builders of the world's finest automobiles. Their advertising emphasized precision engineering, durability, and luxury, attributes that transcended national history. The three-pointed star became a universal symbol of achievement and quality. By 1960, owning a Mercedes-Benz signaled success regardless of the buyer's nationality or political history. The brand had successfully divorced itself from its Nazi past. Company histories published during this period mentioned the war only in passing. Factories were damaged, production stopped, then resumed. The forced labor, the concentration camp prisoners, the weapons manufacturing, all of this simply disappeared from official narratives. Mercedes-Benz wasn't unique in this approach. BMW, which had manufactured aircraft engines and employed forced labor, followed the same strategy. So did Volkswagen, literally created by the Nazi regime to build the KDF wagon. But here's what most people don't know. Even as these companies buried their pasts publicly, internally, they knew exactly what had happened. Archives existed, documents survived. Former executives remembered. They chose institutional amnesia deliberately. The company museum, opened in 1961, told a sanitized story. It displayed pre-war racing cars, showed engineering innovations, celebrated company founders, but offered almost nothing about 1933 to 1945. Visitors could examine the 1914 Grand Prix car, learn about the first diesel passenger car from 1936, and admire post-war achievements. The 12-year period when Daimler-Benz manufactured weapons using slave labor simply didn't exist in this narrative. Former forced laborers, meanwhile, struggled with poverty and health problems resulting from their wartime treatment. Many had tried to claim compensation from the German government and companies that exploited them, with limited success. West Germany passed several compensation laws between 1953 and 1965, but most excluded Eastern European victims, the majority of forced laborers, because they lived behind the Iron Curtain and couldn't easily file claims. Daimler-Benz's official position, when asked, was that they'd operated under wartime duress, that all German companies faced the same pressures, and that focusing on this period wasn't productive for anyone. They'd paid taxes that funded government compensation programs, and that should suffice. This position held for decades because nobody with sufficient authority challenged it. Journalists wrote about Mercedes-Benz engineering achievements. Automotive.Historian celebrated the brand's racing heritage. Former forced laborers lacked platforms to tell their stories to audiences who'd listen. But in the 1970s, things began shifting. A new generation of Germans, born after the war, started asking uncomfortable questions about what their parents and grandparents did between 1933 and 1945. This generational reckoning initially focused on government and military actions, the Holocaust, war crimes, aggressive war. Corporate complicity received less attention, but it couldn't stay hidden forever. The shift started in universities. Young historians, many of them students in the late 1960s who'd participated in protests against their parents' generation's silence, began researching what German companies did during the Nazi period. These scholars accessed archives that hadn't been thoroughly examined. They found documents in Allied occupation records, German government files, and company archives that detailed industrial collaboration with the regime. In 1974, a doctoral student named Hans Mommsen published research about Volkswagen's origins as a Nazi project. The work documented how the company was created specifically to build Hitler's People's Car and how it used extensive forced labor. Mommsen's research methodology became a template for investigating other companies. He cross-referenced company production records with SS documents about concentration camp labor, interviewed survivors, and built comprehensive evidence about corporate complicity. Other historians followed Mommsen's approach, turning attention to Daimler-Benz, BMW, and other major manufacturers. The research revealed a consistent pattern. German companies had actively cooperated with the Nazi regime, profited from forced labor, and then buried this history after the war. Scholars began accessing archives that hadn't been thoroughly examined. Documents about industrial collaboration with the Nazi regime started appearing in academic publications. Former workers began publishing memoirs that detailed conditions in wartime factories. In 1977, a group of former Daimler-Benz forced laborers published a collective memoir documenting their experiences. The book, titled "We Were Just Numbers," described conditions at Obergheim and other facilities in harrowing detail. The memoir included specific allegations: beatings for working too slowly, deaths from industrial accidents that received no investigation, deliberately inadequate food rations, and casual cruelty from German supervisors. Each allegation was documented with dates, locations, and names. Mercedes-Benz's response to the memoir was silence. The company didn't deny the allegations, didn't offer explanations, simply refused to comment. This non-response was strategic. Acknowledging the book meant validating its contents. Mercedes-Benz maintained their silence through the 1970s, even as this historical re-examination intensified. The company was thriving commercially. The W116 S-Class, launched in 1972, redefined luxury sedans, and Mercedes-Benz sold hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually worldwide. The W116 S-Class represented everything Mercedes-Benz wanted to be in the 1970s: technically advanced, luxurious, safe, and completely disconnected from any historical baggage. The car featured the first production anti-lock braking system, extensive safety engineering, and build quality that set industry standards. Why would they disrupt this success by acknowledging a past that most customers knew nothing about and didn't care to learn? From a business perspective, voluntary disclosure made no sense. But by the early 1980s, the pressure became harder to ignore. Documentaries examined German corporate behavior during the Nazi period. Books appeared specifically about Daimler-Benz's use of forced labor, written by historians who'd accessed government and company archives. One key publication came in 1981. Historian Bernard Bellam published Mercedes in Peace and War, a comprehensive examination of Daimler-Benz's role in the Nazi war machine. Bellam had spent years in archives documenting contracts, production figures, and labor policies. Bellam's work wasn't sensationalized. It was careful, documented scholarship that made the evidence impossible to dismiss. He showed that Daimler-Benz's cooperation wasn't coerced, that the company actively pursued military contracts, and that executives made deliberate choices to use forced labor. In 1983, a group of former forced laborers filed suit against Daimler-Benz in German courts, seeking compensation for their wartime work. The case drew media attention. forcing the company to respond publicly for the first time in decades. Daimler-Benz's initial response followed their decades-old script. They'd operated under wartime conditions, faced the same pressures as all German companies, and already contributed to government compensation programs. The statement was legalistic, defensive, and tone-deaf. The public reaction, particularly from younger Germans, was harsh. This wasn't the 1950s anymore. Society now expected companies to acknowledge historical responsibility, not hide behind legal technicalities. The lawsuit moved slowly through German courts, but its existence kept the issue visible. Journalists investigated further, finding more documentation about working conditions in Daimler-Benz factories during the war. Then in 1986, something shifted internally at Daimler-Benz. Edzard Reuter became chairman of the management board, and he took a different approach than his predecessors. Reuter had been born in 1928, meaning he was a teenager during the Nazi period. Unlike older executives, who'd been adults making decisions during the war, Reuter represented the generation that inherited the consequences rather than creating them. But Reuter's background included something else. His father, Ernst Reuter, had been mayor of West Berlin and an outspoken opponent of both Nazism and Soviet communism. Edzard grew up in a family that valued moral courage and confronting difficult truths. Reuter understood that Daimler-Benz continued denial was becoming untenable. The lawsuits, the scholarly research, the survivor testimonies, all of this evidence was public now. Maintaining silence made the company look guilty of ongoing cover-up rather than wartime cooperation. In 1987, Reuter made a decision that would transform not just Daimler-Benz but German corporate culture. He authorized a comprehensive historical investigation into the company's Nazi-era activities with full access to archives and no restrictions on publication. The decision was controversial within Daimler-Benz. Conservative board members argued that opening archives would damage the brand, expose the company to additional lawsuits, and achieve nothing positive. Better to continue the strategy that had worked for 40 years, silence and moving forward. Reuter disagreed. He believed that Germany had changed, that society now expected corporations to acknowledge historical responsibilities, and that Daimler-Benz's reputation would be better protected by transparency than continued denial. He was also pragmatic. The evidence was already public through scholarly research and survivor testimony. Daimler-Benz could either have this history examined by hostile critics or participate in creating an honest account. Participation at least gave them some control over the process. The company commissioned a group of independent historians to examine everything: documents, photographs, testimony, production records. The historians were given explicit instructions to uncover the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. Leading the historical commission was Hans Pohl, a respected economic historian from the University of Bonn. Pohl had studied German industry extensively and brought credibility that internal company historians couldn't provide. Pohl assembled a team that included specialists in Nazi economic policy, labor history, and automotive technology. The team needed varied expertise because Daimler-Benz's wartime activities crossed so many domains: weapons manufacturing, forced labor, corporate governance under dictatorship. The historians received unprecedented access. Daimler-Benz opened archives that had been closed since the war, provided keys to storage facilities containing wartime documents, and authorized interviews with retired employees who'd worked during the Nazi period. Some of these retired employees were reluctant to talk. They'd kept silent for decades, and reopening this chapter felt like betrayal of colleagues who died believing their wartime actions would remain private. The historians had to persuade them that honesty served everyone better than continued secrecy. The archival work was meticulous. The commission examined production records showing exactly what was manufactured, where, and by whom. They cross-referenced Daimler-Benz documents with SS records about concentration camp labor, building comprehensive evidence about labor sources. They found payment records, the specific amounts Daimler-Benz paid the SS for prisoners, documented in ledgers that nobody had examined publicly since the war. These documents made denial impossible. Here was proof that the company directly funded concentration camps. They found architectural plans for underground factories, complete with notations about prisoner barracks locations and security measures. The plans showed that facilities were designed specifically for forced labor, not just adapted for it. They found correspondence between Daimler-Benz executives and Nazi officials, letters requesting more workers, complaining about prisoner productivity, negotiating payment terms. The letters revealed a business relationship, not coercion. The company was a willing client of the forced labor system. This historical commission worked for several years, examining hundreds of thousands of documents. What they found confirmed the worst suspicions: systematic use of forced labor, deliberate cooperation with the SS, weapons production using concentration camp prisoners, and profiting from human misery. The evidence showed that Daimler-Benz cooperation wasn't reluctant or minimal. It was enthusiastic and extensive. The company competed with other manufacturers for military contracts, expanded facilities specifically for weapons production, and integrated forced labor systematically into operations. The historians also documented the post-war cover-up. They found evidence that company officials deliberately destroyed some records, that official histories were sanitized, that former executives coordinated their accounts to minimize the appearance of complicity. In 1988, even before the Historical Commission completed its work, Reuter gave a speech acknowledging Daimler-Benz's Nazi past explicitly. He didn't minimize or excuse. He stated plainly that the company had employed forced laborers, built weapons for an aggressive war, and profited from Nazi policies. The speech shocked observers. German corporate leaders simply didn't discuss these topics so directly, but Reuter understood that continued denial had become untenable, and more importantly, that honesty offered the only path to genuine reconciliation. Daimler-Benz faced immediate backlash from some quarters. Conservative business leaders thought the admission was unnecessary and potentially damaging. Some older executives within the company were furious, believing Reuter was tarnishing the brand they'd spent decades rebuilding. But public reaction was largely positive, particularly internationally. Media coverage praised Reuter's courage and contrasted Daimler-Benz's transparency with other German companies that still avoided the topic. More importantly, the acknowledgement changed the conversation. Instead of fighting to keep the past hidden, Daimler-Benz could now participate in discussions about corporate responsibility, reparations, and historical education. The Historical Commission published its first comprehensive findings in 1990. The documentation was devastating. Detailed accounts of working conditions, photographs of facilities, production records showing exactly what was manufactured and by whom. The Commission's work revealed that Daimler-Benz's wartime conduct was neither unusual nor inevitable. The company made specific choices to pursue weapons contracts, to request concentration camp labor, to prioritize profit over human welfare. These weren't passive responses to circumstances. They were active decisions. Daimler-Benz didn't just acknowledge the findings, they published them. The company released books and sponsored exhibitions about their Nazi past, making the information accessible to scholars, journalists, and the general public. In 1998, Daimler-Benz established a humanitarian fund with 12 million Deutschmarks, approximately $7 million, to compensate surviving forced laborers. The amount was symbolic rather than comprehensive, but it represented the first time the company had directly paid individuals for their wartime suffering. Other German companies watched this process carefully. If Daimler-Benz, one of Germany's most prestigious brands, could acknowledge its Nazi past without destroying its reputation, perhaps others could do the same. Volkswagen commissioned its own historical study in 1996, examining the company's origins as a Nazi project and its extensive use of forced labor. BMW followed in 1997, appointing historians to investigate aircraft engine production and weapons manufacturing. These investigations followed Daimler-Benz's template: independent historians, full archive access, no restrictions on publication. The companies learned from Daimler-Benz's experience that transparency, however painful initially, was better than discovery through external pressure. Volkswagen's Historical Commission, led by historian Hans Mommsen, discovered that the company had employed approximately 20,000 forced laborers during the war, a massive percentage of the wartime workforce. Many were concentration camp prisoners, others Soviet POWs, all working in brutal conditions. The VW study also revealed something particularly disturbing. The company's involvement with forced labor began before the first cars were even produced. The factory construction itself used concentration camp labor, meaning VW's physical existence was built on slave labor. BMW's investigation uncovered similar patterns. The company had manufactured aircraft engines using forced labor, employed approximately 50,000 forced workers during the war, and operated facilities near concentration camps. The findings paralleled Daimler-Benz's history in uncomfortable detail. This wave of corporate historical reckoning came too late for many survivors. Most former forced laborers were elderly or had died by the 1990s. But for those still living, the acknowledgement mattered. Their suffering was finally recognized officially. The acknowledgements also created pressure for compensation. If German companies were admitting they profited from slave labor, shouldn't they compensate the victims? The question became unavoidable, both morally and legally. Individual companies had made small compensation payments in the 1990s, but these efforts were fragmented and inadequate. Many survivors received nothing because they lived in Eastern Europe, where reaching them was difficult, or because they didn't know which companies to pursue for compensation. In 1998, German industry and the government established the Foundation Initiative of German Enterprises to coordinate compensation payments to all surviving Nazi-era forced laborers. Daimler-Benz was a major contributor. The foundation was capitulated with 10 billion Deutsche Marks, approximately 5 billion euros, contributed jointly by German government and industry. Major corporations, including Daimler-Benz, Volkswagen, BMW, Siemens, and others, contributed based on their size and documented use of forced labor. The foundation's challenge was identifying survivors and processing claims. Millions of people had been forced laborers during the war, but 6 decades later, most were dead. The foundation advertised internationally, worked with survivor organizations, and established claims processes in multiple countries. The foundation distributed over 4 billion euros to approximately 1.7 million surviving victims between 2000 and 2007. Individual payments ranged from 2,500 to 7,500 euros, amounts that couldn't compensate for years of suffering but acknowledged responsibility. The payment amounts were calculated based on type of forced labor endured. Concentration camp survivors received the maximum 7,500 euros. Those who'd worked as civilian forced laborers in factories received 2,500 euros. Soviet POWs fell into different categories depending on conditions. These amounts seem modest. How does 7,500 euros compensate for years in a concentration camp, for permanent injuries, for watching friends die? The foundation acknowledged the payments were symbolic rather than truly compensatory, but argued that some recognition was better than none. Critics pointed out that the compensation came over 50 years after the crimes, that most victims were dead, and that the amounts were tiny compared to corporate profits, built partly on slave labor. These criticisms were valid. The compensation was inadequate by any reasonable standard. But the process mattered beyond money. It established official acknowledgement from German industry that forced labor had occurred, that corporations had profited, and that survivors deserved recognition. This acknowledgement changed how corporate history was understood and taught. Mercedes-Benz transformation from denial to acknowledgement became a case study in corporate responsibility. Business schools taught it, historians analyzed it, and other companies facing historical reckonings studied it. But the real question is, why did this matter for automotive history? How did confronting the Nazi past change German car companies in ways that affected the cars themselves? The answer lies in corporate culture and values. When German automakers acknowledged their darkest chapter, they committed to transparency as a core principle. This wasn't just public relations. It fundamentally changed how these companies operated. Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, and Audi became obsessive about documenting everything. Every design decision, every engineering choice, every business strategy was recorded meticulously, not just for legal compliance, but because institutional memory mattered. This documentation culture created competitive advantages. German automakers could track problems to their sources faster than competitors, could verify quality control systematically, could improve processes based on documented history rather than anecdotal memory. The commitment to transparency extended to product quality and safety. German automakers became known for acknowledging defects quickly and issuing recalls proactively, a stark contrast to manufacturers who fought admitting problems until forced by regulators. When Volkswagen faced the diesel emissions scandal in 2015, the contrast with their Nazi past handling was instructive. The company initially tried to minimize and deny, reverting to the old corporate instincts. The backlash was severe because VW had supposedly learned that transparency was essential. Eventually, Volkswagen returned to the lessons from the 1990s, acknowledge the problem fully, accept responsibility, commit to reform. The diesel scandal cost the company tens of billions, but the company survived because they built institutional practices around confronting difficult truths. Compare this to American automakers' handling of their own scandals. GM's ignition switch defect killed at least 124 people, but the company's initial response was to minimize and deflect. Ford's Pinto fuel tank design led to hundreds of deaths, and internal documents showed the company calculated that paying lawsuits was cheaper than fixing the design. Japanese automakers, too, struggled with transparency. Toyota's acceleration issues in the late 2000s led to massive recalls only after the company fought against acknowledging the problems. Takata's airbag crisis demonstrated similar resistance to open disclosure. German automakers, shaped by their reckoning with the Nazi past, generally handled similar situations differently, more transparently, with faster acknowledgement, accepting responsibility rather than minimizing. This wasn't perfection, but it was a measurably different corporate culture. The Nazi past also influenced German automotive design philosophy in subtle ways. Post-war Mercedes-Benz emphasized safety features earlier and more comprehensively than most competitors. The company pioneered crumple zones in 1951, developed anti-lock braking systems in the 1970s, and made safety a core brand value. This emphasis partly reflected genuine engineering priorities, but it also served symbolic purposes. A company that had built weapons and profited from suffering now positioned itself as protecting human life. The brand transformation from arms manufacturer to safety innovator was deliberate. BMW's ultimate driving machine positioning emphasized joy and freedom, the opposite of the regimentation and oppression of the Nazi period. The company's motorsport heritage was promoted aggressively, connecting BMW to competitive sport rather than war. Audi's transformation from Auto Union, which had used extensive forced labor, to a premium brand emphasizing technological innovation represented another form of historical distancing. The Quattro all-wheel drive system, launched in 1980, gave Audi an identity separate from its troubled past. These weren't just marketing strategies. They reflected genuine commitments to building products that served civilian needs, enhanced lives, and avoided the militaristic associations that haunted the company's Nazi-era activities. The transparency culture also affected how German automakers approached environmental regulations and sustainability. When emissions standards tightened, German companies generally led in developing compliant technologies, until the VW diesel scandal revealed the limits of this transformation. But even the diesel scandal demonstrates how the Nazi past reckoning shaped corporate behavior. VW's deception was shocking, precisely because German automakers were supposed to be different, supposed to have learned that covering up problems was unsustainable. The scandal's resolution showed these lessons being reapplied. VW acknowledged wrongdoing, accepted massive financial penalties, fired responsible executives, and committed to electric vehicle transformation. The company treated the diesel crisis as another historical reckoning moment. Mercedes-Benz's museum, updated in 2006 with a new building, now includes extensive documentation of the company's Nazi past. Visitors see the 770 Grosser limousines built for Hitler, alongside explanations of their historical context and the company's complicity. The museum doesn't hide or minimize. It presents the evidence straightforwardly, acknowledging that these luxury vehicles were manufactured while concentration camp prisoners built aircraft engines in brutal conditions. The juxtaposition is intentional and uncomfortable. This educational approach extended to corporate training. Mercedes-Benz employees, particularly those in management, receive education about company history, including the Nazi period. The message is explicit. We must never forget, because forgetting enabled denial for 40 years. The Nazi past reckoning also influenced German automakers' approach to globalization. When expanding into new markets, particularly in countries with authoritarian governments, German companies became more cautious about complicity than their American or Japanese competitors. This caution wasn't perfect. German automakers still pursued growth and profit, but there was generally more internal discussion about the ethics of certain partnerships and business relationships. The historical lesson that short-term profit from cooperation with oppressive regimes creates long-term liability had been learned expensively. The contrast with other industries is instructive. German chemical companies, particularly BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, all successors to IG Farben, which manufactured Zyklon B for gas chambers, faced similar reckonings. But automotive companies, more visible to consumers, felt pressure earlier and responded more comprehensively. By the 2000s, acknowledging and learning from the Nazi past had become part of German corporate identity. When Mercedes-Benz or BMW or Volkswagen faced criticism, whether over emissions, labor practices, or safety issues, they increasingly defaulted to transparency rather than denial. This wasn't altruism, it was pragmatism learned from history. The companies discovered that 40 years of denial followed by forced acknowledgement was more damaging than proactive transparency. Short-term embarrassment beats long-term institutional dishonesty. The transformation also affected international perceptions of German business. By the 2000s, German engineering connoted not just technical excellence, but also ethical manufacturing, transparent practices, and corporate responsibility. The Nazi past, acknowledged and confronted, somehow strengthened rather than weakened the brand. This seems paradoxical. How does admitting to forced labor and weapons manufacturing make a brand stronger? But the logic is clear. Companies that acknowledge their worst moments and demonstrate genuine change are more trustworthy than companies still hiding their histories. American automotive companies, by contrast, never faced equivalent historical reckoning moments. GM and Ford had manufactured weapons during World War II, but for the Allied side, their wartime production was celebrated, not buried. They never developed the same institutional pressure for transparency. Ford built bombers, GM produced tanks and aircraft engines, Chrysler manufactured weapons systems, all for the Allied war effort. This production was heroic, contributing to victory over fascism. Nobody questioned whether these companies should acknowledge wartime manufacturing. The difference shaped corporate cultures fundamentally. American automakers learned that government partnerships during crises were opportunities, not embarrassments. They developed relationships with defense departments that continued through the Cold War and beyond. This created different reflexes when problems emerged. American companies' first instinct when facing scandals was often containment. Protect the brand, minimize damage, control information flow. They hadn't learned through painful experience that transparency ultimately costs less than discovered cover-ups. The GM ignition switch defect illustrated this difference. The faulty switches caused at least 124 deaths, but GM's initial response focused on legal liability rather than moral responsibility. The company waited years to issue recalls, faced massive criticism for the delay, and ultimately paid billions in settlements and fines. Mary Barra, who became GM's CEO in 2014, eventually changed the company's approach, acknowledging the failures, accepting responsibility, implementing reforms. But this transparency came only after external pressure forced it, not as the company's first instinct. Ford's Pinto fuel tank design demonstrated similar patterns decades earlier. Internal documents showed the company calculated that paying lawsuits from deaths caused by fuel tank ruptures would cost less than redesigning the tank. The calculation was rational from a profit perspective, but morally bankrupt. When the Pinto documents became public through legal discovery, Ford faced enormous criticism. The company's defense, that they'd followed industry practices and met regulatory standards, only made the situation worse. Ford was prioritizing legal compliance over human safety. These scandals didn't destroy Ford or GM, but they damaged reputations in ways that German automakers who confronted their Nazi pasts had learned to avoid. The American companies kept repeating patterns. Problem emerges, company minimizes, external pressure builds, company eventually acknowledges, damage is amplified by the delay. Japanese automakers rebuilt from even more complete destruction than German companies, but Japan's post-war culture emphasized moving forward rather than examining wartime conduct. Toyota and Nissan's wartime activities were never subjected to the same historical scrutiny as German manufacturers. This difference in historical reckoning created different corporate cultures. German automakers learned painfully and belatedly that institutional honesty was essential. American and Japanese manufacturers didn't face the same pressure, didn't develop the same reflexes. Toyota's origins included military truck production for Japan's Imperial Army. The company manufactured vehicles used in Japan's invasion of China and throughout the Pacific War, but post-war Japanese culture focused on reconstruction and economic development, not examining corporate wartime roles. When Toyota became the world's largest automaker in the 2000s, the company's history focused on Toyota production system, innovations, quality management, and post-war growth. Wartime manufacturing was mentioned briefly, if at all, without detailed examination of what was produced or how. Nissan's predecessor companies also manufactured military vehicles and aircraft components during the war. But like Toyota, Nissan's corporate history emphasized post-war achievements rather than wartime activities. Japanese culture's approach to wartime history, national focus on suffering in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, less emphasis on Japan's aggressive actions, shaped corporate attitudes. Companies that in Germany would have faced pressure for historical reckoning in Japan faced minimal scrutiny. This created vulnerabilities when scandals emerged. Toyota's acceleration problems in the late 2000s demonstrated how the company handled crises: initial denial, minimization, resistance to recalls, eventual capitulation, only under regulatory pressure. The acceleration issue caused crashes and deaths, but Toyota's first response was defending their products rather than investigating concerns. The company suggested driver error, blamed floor mats, resisted acknowledging that electronic throttle controls might have defects. Eventually, Toyota recalled millions of vehicles and paid billions in settlements, but the delay amplified damage. If the company had developed German automakers' reflexes around proactive transparency, the crisis might have been contained earlier at lower cost. Takata's airbag crisis demonstrated similar patterns. The Japanese supplier manufactured defective airbag inflators that could explode, sending metal fragments into vehicle cabins. The defects killed at least 27 people and injured hundreds. Takata's response followed classic patterns: deny the problem, minimize the scope, resist comprehensive recalls, blame testing procedures rather than design flaws. The approach prolonged the crisis, increased costs, and ultimately bankrupted the company. German automakers, shaped by their Nazi past reckoning, generally handled similar situations differently. When problems emerged, their institutional culture, developed through confronting historical failures, pushed toward faster acknowledgement and resolution. This wasn't perfection. Volkswagen's diesel emissions scandal proved that cultural transformation doesn't prevent individual groups from making catastrophic decisions. But even the diesel crisis showed how the lessons from historical reckoning influenced responses. VW's initial reaction to the diesel scandal followed old patterns: deny, minimize, The practical results became visible in how companies handled scandals. When problems emerged, that choice, commission unrestricted, this matters in today's automotive industry, where trust is currency. Electric vehicle claims, autonomous driving promises, sustainability commitments, all of these require consumers to trust that manufacturers are being honest. German automakers' historical reckoning makes that trust more credible. The company's eventual response returned to transparency lessons learned in the 1990s, acknowledge the full scope of wrongdoing, accept responsibility without excuses, fire responsible executives, commit to systematic reform, and accept financial consequences. VW paid over 30 billion euros in fines, settlements, and recall costs. Multiple executives faced criminal charges. The company committed to electric vehicle transformation as a form of corporate penance. These actions, while expensive, probably saved Volkswagen from worse outcomes. Compare that to Mitsubishi's fuel economy scandal in 2016, where the Japanese automaker admitted falsifying fuel efficiency data for 25 years. Mitsubishi's response was less transparent, less comprehensive, and the company's recovery was slower as a result. The practical results became visible in how companies handled scandals. When problems emerged, that choice to commission unrestricted, this matters in today's automotive industry, where trust is currency. Electric vehicle claims, autonomous driving promises, sustainability commitments, all of these require consumers to trust that manufacturers are being honest. German automakers' historical reckoning makes that trust more credible. Of course, German automakers weren't perfect. The VW diesel scandal proved that institutional culture doesn't prevent individuals from making unethical decisions. But the response to the scandal showed that the cultural lessons still mattered. Mercedes-Benz today positions itself explicitly around responsibility and transparency. The company's sustainability reports are comprehensive, detailing not just environmental metrics but also labor practices, supply chain ethics, and corporate governance. This emphasis traces directly to the lessons learned from confronting the Nazi past. The company learned that hiding uncomfortable truths only delays and amplifies their eventual exposure. Better to address problems proactively than wait for external pressure. The historical legacy also influences product development. German automakers invest heavily in safety research, autonomous driving technology that could save lives, and electric vehicles that reduce environmental impact. These aren't just market-driven decisions, they reflect corporate values shaped by historical reckoning. When Mercedes-Benz engineers develop collision avoidance systems, or BMW researchers work on accident-preventing autonomous features, they're continuing a tradition that started as atonement. The company that built weapons now builds systems to protect life. This transformation wasn't inevitable. German automakers could have continued denying their Nazi past indefinitely. Many other German companies did so well into the 2000s. But in 1987, Edzard Reuter made a different choice. That choice to commission unrestricted, this matters in today's automotive industry, where trust is currency. Electric vehicle claims, autonomous driving promises, sustainability commitments, all of these require consumers to trust that manufacturers are being honest. German automakers' historical reckoning makes that trust more credible. The lesson extends beyond automotive history. Reuter demonstrated that confronting institutional wrongdoing, no matter how old or how buried, was ultimately better for long-term survival than continued denial. The short-term pain of acknowledgement beats the long-term cost of discovered cover-up. For automotive enthusiasts, this history matters because it shaped the cars themselves. The Mercedes-Benz S-Class emphasizes safety because the company learned to value transparency over image. BMW's driving dynamics reflect a corporate culture that prizes genuine performance over inflated claims. Volkswagen's electric vehicle push, accelerated after the diesel scandal, continues the pattern. Acknowledge the problem, accept responsibility, commit to systematic change. The company learned these lessons from confronting Nazi past complicity, forgot them temporarily, and relearned them expensively. The Nazi past that Mercedes-Benz tried to erase for 40 years became paradoxically the foundation of its modern identity. By acknowledging what they'd done, accepting responsibility, and committing to different values, German automakers created something unique in corporate culture. American automakers compete on performance and value. Japanese manufacturers emphasize reliability and efficiency. German brands offer something additional: institutional trustworthiness, built on confronted history. They're not perfect, but they're companies that proved they could change. This matters in today's automotive industry, where trust is currency. Electric vehicle claims, autonomous driving promises, sustainability commitments, all of these require consumers to trust that manufacturers are being honest. German automakers' historical reckoning makes that trust more credible. The story also reveals why transparency became a competitive advantage. In an information age where corporate secrets eventually surface, companies with cultures of disclosure handle crises better than companies still operating on 20th century concealment principles. Mercedes-Benz journey from denying forced labor to publishing comprehensive historical documentation demonstrates this evolution. The company went from hiding its darkest chapter to using it as educational material, from institutional embarrassment to corporate wisdom. The transformation took 42 years to begin, and another decade to fully realize. That's 2 generations of employees, millions of vehicles produced, countless opportunities to come clean that were deliberately avoided. The delay itself became part of the lesson. Because here's the final truth: the delay didn't work. Hiding the Nazi past didn't protect Mercedes-Benz reputation. It just meant that when the truth emerged, the cover-up amplified the damage. Reuter recognized this, and his decision to embrace transparency rather than continue denial saved the company from worse scandal. Today, when you see a Mercedes-Benz 3-pointed star, you're looking at a symbol that means different things to different people. To many, it still represents luxury and engineering excellence, but it also represents a company that confronted its worst history, acknowledged institutional wrongdoing, and built new values on that foundation. The Nazi past Mercedes-Benz tried to erase, didn't disappear. It transformed into a lesson about corporate responsibility that changed an industry, and that transformation from weapons manufacturer using slave labor to transparency advocate and safety pioneer might be the most remarkable engineering achievement in automotive history. Because rebuilding trust is harder than building cars, and Mercedes-Benz proved that even the most tarnished reputation, confronted honestly and reformed genuinely, could be reconstructed on a foundation of truth rather than buried secrets.